Hey friends, I'm ready to read the third grade purple book called George Washington Carver by Minnie to Many. Now, some of you are probably thinking, I can make a text-to-text connection because I remember that name. I believe he wrote another book that was about him. A weed is a flower. Some of you did that for the booklet, and you might recall. All right, here we go. It's against my better judgment folding a book like this, but I want you to be able to mute me and read it yourself. So here we go. Susan Carver stood in front of her cabin home while a little boy emptied his pockets. The boy's name was George. Susan and her husband Moses had cared for George since he was a baby. George had been out wandering in the woods again. George loved the woods near the Carver farm in Missouri. He also brought back plants, insects, rocks, frogs, and an occasional reptile. Aunt Sue didn't mind George collected things. She just didn't want his collections in the cabin. Susan and Moses Carver knew George had special gifts. Why, the young boy had planted his own garden in the woods. He had even done experiments with soil and sunlight. Not many farm kids did that. Most people who knew George thought he was a genius. And here's a quote from George Washington Carver. It says, I wanted to know the names of every stone and flower and insect and bird and beast, and I wanted to know where it got its color, where it got its life, but there was no one to tell me. So he figured it out himself, I guess, huh? All right. One smart kid. The Carvers were determined to get George a good education, but the schools nearest to his house were for white children only. When George was about 12, he was sent to a school for African American children. The school was 8 miles from the Carver's farm, so George lived with a family who had a house close to the school. Caption: George went to a school for African American children like this one. But the school was too easy for George. He was by far the smartest boy there. George left the school and moved to Missouri, where he could get a better education. In school, George was a star student. After George graduated, he started his own laundry business. But George still had a thirst to learn more. He wanted to go to college. The College Challenge. In 1885, George got a letter from a college in Highland, Kansas, inviting him to attend. But when George arrived at the college, they turned him away. They hadn't realized he was African American. Like many colleges at that time, this one was only for white students. George was very disappointed, but he kept reading and learning on his own. I think we can think of some mindset words that go with George, huh? George Carver was only the second African American to go to Simpson College. On a visit to Iowa, George met a family that encouraged him to go to the local college. In 1887, George started taking classes at Simpson College. He was only the second African American student to go there. He studied art and music, but George wanted to study plants and farming. He switched to Iowa State Agricultural College, where he learned about crops, soils, fertilizers, farm animals, and more. A great teaching career begins. George was a top student at Iowa State. After he graduated, he was asked to stay on and teach. He also began doing research about plants and their many uses. Soon, scientists around the country heard about George and his plant studies. One day, a letter arrived at George's office from the famous educator Booker T. Washington, who had started a school for African Americans in Alabama called the Tuskegee Institute. It was a signal that George Washington Carver's life was about to change forever. Caption: Tuskegee Institute's aim was to help African Americans get an education. This is a picture, and the caption says, Carver worked with farmers to improve the way they grew crops. So here's a picture. Okay, here we go. Booker T. Washington wanted Carver to start up a new agricultural program at Tuskegee. He knew that most African Americans in the South were farmers. Teaching them about farming was the best way to improve their lives. Carver accepted the job, even though it paid little. Helping poor farmers. There were many poor African American farmers in the South. They had been growing only cotton for so many years, it had ruined the soil at their farms. The farmers also had problems with insects that were eating their crops. Carver taught the farmers better ways to farm. He wrote simple booklets for them and held meetings to teach them how to improve their crops. He also taught them how to grow beautiful and healthful foods. The primary idea in all of my work was to help the farmer and fill the poor man's empty dinner pail. Another quote from George Washington Carver. Now this caption says crops such as peanuts and had another advantage. Insects did not eat them. So here's an image. The caption goes with it. Carver believed in using natural products to improve soils and help plants grow. He wanted farmers to plant crops such as peanuts and sweet potatoes that made the soil healthier. But that gave Carter another problem to solve. If so many farmers grew peanuts and sweet potatoes, he would have to find more ways to use these crops. Carver experimented in the laboratory. He used simple gadgets and processors to make hundreds of new products from these crops. All of these things could help the farmers make money in new ways. Caption: Carver worked in his laboratory to invent new uses for common farm crops. Fame follows. Carver's work made him famous across the country. The United States government asked him to work on plant products. He was even offered a job by Thomas Edison, famous for his invention of the electric light bulb. But Carver chose to stay at Tuskegee and continue his work to improve the lives of farmers. Caption: Carver kept working and teaching into his 70s. Caption: The United States Postal Service honored Carver with a stamp. George Washington Carver died in 1943 at the age of 79. He was buried at Tuskegee Institute. The following words were written on his gravestone. They say what is most important about this great man. He could have added fortune to fame, but caring for neither, he found happiness and honor in being helpful to the world. Now, this last page, as you can see, is a timeline. Now, the timeline doesn't go that way. I mean, it could, but it'd be hard to read that way. So we're going to keep it this way. And this is the life of George Washington Carver. So in 1864, and I noticed that there's a question mark because perhaps they're not exactly sure when he was born in 1864. He was born in Missouri. Remember, there were not a lot of records on African Americans born at that time. At that time, most of them were slaves, and there was not a lot of documentation to go along with them. 1877, he attends school. 1884, he completes his high school. 1891 to 96, he attends college. 1896, he begins working at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Then we go to 1921, where Carver's speech to the U.S. Congress about uses for the peanut makes him famous. 1940, Carver donates all of his money to Tuskegee Institute for agricultural research. Now that is a very selfless man right there. 1943, he dies at the age of 79. All right, friends, grab your paper and get to work.